UN Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed, welcome back to SABC News.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
As we move into the high-level week of the General Assembly, we see two broad competing themes emerging. Geopolitical divides from the war in Ukraine to coups in West Africa. The conflict in Sudan comes to mind. And then the very broad developmental agenda and a key SDG summit which seeks to reinvigorate momentum on implementation that continues to lag at the midway point of the 2030 development agenda. You say that the United Nations was designed specifically for moments of challenge like those before us. And yet there are very real doubts, DSG, that this institution, in its current form, can meet this moment. How do you thread this needle?
It's tough, but we don't give up on hope, right? I mean, this was a very ambitious agenda at a time no one thought we could make the transition from a set of MDGs, 8 of them, that were pretty narrow, but they did galvanize a collective response to something that's much deeper, that talks about people's economies, people's governance systems, the planet itself, and the crisis that we're going through. So it was never going to be an easy lift. Halfway through, it really is sobering. I mean, the targets that are being met globally, 15% is miserable. And then we are exacerbating this with the crises that you talk about. However, there are signs that in spite of that all, efforts are being made and things are happening. And what we need to do is to come back here and have an honest conversation on how we're going to keep the promise in the second half. And there are indications of that where we're seeing the frustrations and the voice of Africa actually out there now. It was before very muted. Now it's out there. It happened at the Africa Climate Summit, where everyone is saying, look, we have solutions to offer. This is not just a charity case. Investments are what are needed, and this is where we need the investments. We need them in energy. We need them in food systems. We need them in education. So people are being very specific. And I think that sort of sobering moment of how far off track we are could, at this moment of crisis, which is what we're set up for, provide the impetus to get it right.
The issue of multipolarity appears to be the new buzzword on the geopolitical stage, particularly in the context of growing geopolitical mistrust driven by the big powers, Russia, China, the United States. And yet, we have a United Nations that is built on the principle of consensus that is increasingly hard to achieve. We often hear from people like yourself the urgent need to build trust, cohesion, solidarity among member states. But how do you get there in practice when national self-interest and sovereignty continues to show themselves as major obstacles to that consensus?
I think the international impetus to do something has always been in one's national interest. What we have to do is to find common ground in those national interests that will get us back in this town hall to have these discussions. Since probably the war in Ukraine, everyone's gone off into their echo chambers, where that's where they're getting the responses they need for the electorates they have. And whether it's you're suffering under that impact of the war and the climate crisis, or the lack of recovery from COVID, or it's one where you want to get the support you need to do what you need to do to respond to the war, it's not in the United Nations. And that's what we need to do, is to say, look, we've got some problems here that are bigger than any one region or country. And it has always been that way. And that's why we have these discussions here. They're not comfortable discussions. You're not going to like hearing some of the stuff that you hear, but you have to hear it in order to find a solution to solve it. And maybe in this opportunity of the 78th, we can achieve that. And I'm hoping that with the number of heads of state and government that we have coming, the fact that everybody's going to be reminded about the SDG promise, that we can garner some support for humanity and what everyone's facing, which is really, it's not knowing what's going to happen next. The uncertainty of it all needs leadership, and it needs some concrete pathways that people can get back on track.
So in the context of that leadership, you mentioned the heads of state and government that are coming, but only of the permanent 5 heads of state and government to attend this year's UNGA is, wait for it, the United States. President Macron from France is staying home, the UK's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is at home, China's Xi Jinping, and of course Russia's President Vladimir Putin. What does it say, DSG, about the importance of a gathering like this in New York when the power brokers, or certainly with the largest clout in the world, are not coming?
There are going to be a lot of questions out for leaders who have power as to why they're not at the table when the global town hall comes together, and they will have the explanations they have.
So you agree it's not good that they're not?
I don't think it's. I think it's not good. I think that when the P5 don't turn up for a meeting of this importance, it's not just a general debate. It is halfway through what we need to do for humanity in consideration of the planet. And these are really big crises when you look at the figures on poverty, inequality, and the climate crisis. So they should be here because they are the ones who can step up and make the change, the pivot to getting to 2030. Having said that, there are 193 states, and there are heads of state and government of countries, small with loud voices, who can move people to action. And you know, we have great women like Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, small island, big voice, has put those issues in front of people, where the big leaders have come up to the table. You'll see in the G20 declaration that those issues have been acknowledged. We now have a hook. We can take this forward in the discussions that we have next week. And you know, we will miss our big leaders, but the show will go on.
So in the developmental context, the SDGs are the agreed blueprint for a sustainable and prosperous future. But as you mentioned, right, the latest SDG progress report shows that just 15% of the SDG targets are on track, while progress on 50% is weak or insufficient, while we've stalled or gone in reverse on more than 30% of the goals. What are the consequences of that in action?
Well, that's people, right? It is people who are not going to get their children into school. It is people going to bed hungry. It is many humanitarian contexts where it is double trouble for those who are having to flee. Many will not survive. It is a lack of investment in infrastructure so that when climate crisis hits, devastation around the world. So it has faces behind those numbers and those percentages that we talk about. And that's, I think, of what is what of great concern. But we know that the major challenge has always been the means of implementation. And we're very specific about that because we have asks for energy transition. So where are the resources going to come for investing that? But we're not doing energy transition in a silo. We're doing that with food systems, and because you need to power the food systems. If you want to have a smart farm, it's not going to come out of fresh air. How do you connect that there? But even that needs technology and the digital investment. So we're speaking to all of these issues. We know exactly what it is we have to do. Now we have to talk about the financial systems, getting into gear to respond. And you would have heard the Secretary-General, first of all, say that that's not happening because we're in a system that doesn't respond to the needs today.
But in terms of that transition, we're also seeing some divergent views in terms of, for example, the conversation around energy transition and fossil fuels. One of the key meetings next week is a climate ambition summit, and part of that is this race, right, to eradicate fossil fuels from the planet. But countries like South Africa are claiming energy poverty and the need to use natural resources, including new oil and gas exploration, to strengthen the economy and build the energy security they seek. How do you respond to that sort of narrative?
Well, the first thing I'd be asking is that are they in the narrative that says we've got to see an end to fossil fuels, and that is the right direction in which we need to get to for net zero? And I think every one of those countries will say absolutely. They signed up to the Paris
But
Agreement.
not by 2040 or by 2050.
Maybe not. But I mean, they need to start that journey. And I think, you know, very much countries that had least to do with what we're receiving from climate probably need to look at the pact that the SG suggests, which is emerging economies can do a little more, but the developed economies can do so much more. And somewhere we will find the balance to get transitions that are just and equitable for many developing countries on track. You know, once you start that 10, 20, 30-mile journey, if you can accelerate halfway across, it may be that we make those lines. We've just got to start, and we've got to do less talking about what is not appropriate and more about what we can get done. Because right now, we're reversing. We're not going forward. And we really need to get forward on those.
But isn't exploring for new oil deposits reversing? Let me tell you what South Africa's Mineral Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe says. Quote, "We can't be only about decarbonization. We must deal with energy poverty. We must never allow ourselves to be encircled by the developed nations who fund lobbyists to put our country's developmental needs against their own self-serving protection of the environment. Our country deserves an opportunity to transition at pace and scale determined by its citizens." I mean, that's pretty specific stuff. It very much counters the narrative coming out of the UN.
It's very specific, but you have conversations on energy security today. You have some of our Security Council members who are putting out 100 new, signing up 100 new exploration licenses in their territory. These are for countries that are already developed. I think that we have to listen to what developing countries are saying. I think that there is a lot of there's a lot of justification to say, yes, my citizens come first. After all, that's why they're elected to government, to take care of their interests. However, I do think that in the green transition, we need to look for those resources that would allow that greener transition to happen faster. In the case of the just transition in South Africa, those resources were not forthcoming as quickly as they thought they would be. And by the way, when you're looking at developing countries without the infrastructure to make these transitions really fast, they could leapfrog if they got the resources for the green transition.
Yeah, the SDG,
if they don't, it will take much longer.
The SDG funding gap, $2.5 trillion. OECD puts that figure at $4.2 trillion, while many developing countries are buried in debt. And of course, it speaks to that, the need for the reform of the international financial institutions.
Well, there you're coming into another issue, which we have said right up in front and center. We have an SDG stimulus that the SG has put on the table, which is for the here and now. And that could help with some of the energy transitions that South Africa and others talk about. There is the longer term, which needs to start being redesigned today. That's the international financial architecture. It does not work for countries today. It was designed in a time where it was fit for purpose, no longer fit for purpose. No. But there will also be geopolitical tensions in that discussion, because it will include governance and the way these institutions are run. So it will be uphill, but we think that with the acknowledgement of the SDG stimulus of the G20, which now has become the G21, we're very hopeful that we'll begin to see, with institutions we have now, some response to the finance that's needed.
In the context of the upward slope that you talk about, one of the biggest threats to the 2030 agenda is not only the lack of adequate resources, right, finance, particularly in the context of that just transition, but also DSG, conflicts and the prolific number of coups we have seen in West and Central Africa over the last few years. As we often, as you often know, it's these development deficits that lead to these complicated coups and conflicts in the region. What's your reading of what's happening in Africa right now?
Well, for me, it's a very big wake-up call to the social contract. You have democracies that are in place. Many of them are a work in progress. And when they don't deliver for people, it leaves people and a country vulnerable to instances like coups. And when you're seeing coups that are being celebrated, you have to think twice. Why would that happen? There's coups in the past were never celebrated, and today they are. So I think it is a question for us to look again back inwards. These models for democracy, the resources that are needed for a democracy to thrive is not just an election. It is about delivering on services for education, for health, for someone to have a job, to have hope, to have some predictability that that nation is growing and that they will be a part of it. When that's absent, that's a big problem. Now, that's a national problem, but it's also an international problem, because we don't live on islands. We live within this global community where the economy itself and external factors will come to bear on it.
The war in Ukraine seems to have no clear end in sight. The grain deal, once lauded as one of the greatest diplomatic achievements by the current SG, now stalled due to Russia's exit from the agreement in July over obstacles to its own fertilizer and food exports, and complaints that too much of Ukraine's foodstuffs were not reaching poorer countries in need. How will current UN efforts overcome the intransigence we are now witnessing from the Russian Federation?
I think it's about talking to all sides on this. Quite rightly, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was an amazing initiative that succeeded, and millions of people did get fed. But more than just access to food, the cost of living came down. Now, of course, it's skyrocketing again, to the extent that debt service payments are taking over from paying for school and education, and it is expensive. And I went home recently, and at home people were eating 3 times a week. I mean, this is not possible, you would think, in our villages. And this is where there is some production. And so I think that we have to see that what is happening in Ukraine has direct impacts on livelihoods in poorer countries. Food did get to people in the world, and there's lots of evidence for that. However, the negotiations that continue now there are options and solutions on the table for which we hope Russia will respond to. And as you can see, the UN is working very closely with Turkey to see what we can get done.
The Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has been clear that the window for peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, in line with the UN Charter and international law, currently does not exist. But there's also been criticism, DSG, of the UN not fully deploying its good officers. The UN is not leading this conflict towards a viable peace settlement negotiation. What do you make of that criticism in the greater scheme of things here?
I think there can always be more efforts, better efforts, but usually, that comes from hindsight is 2020 vision, right?
Could the UN have done more, I guess, is the simple way of
I don't think in the current circumstances we necessarily, as a secretariat and the good offices you talk about, could have done more without the explicit inward leaning by member states to make that happen. Good offices are not used in isolation. They're used in order to move two sides or three sides together to get to where we need to go.
So what then is the role of countries in the BRICS, for example, partners of the Russian Federation, your China, your Brazil, India, South Africa? And now a few others, of course.
No, I think you've seen them all come together to try to move Russia to find a peaceful resolution.
But are they doing enough?
I think they could do more. I think everyone could do more. I think we all need to do more. The war needs to stop. We need to find a pathway to peace. We need to think less about winning the war and more about how we might make peace and we stop the war. And I think for that, perhaps if you see more women at the table, that might happen.
We're going to hear a lot about Security Council reform. We're going to hear a lot about international financial institutional reform. Where are we in that conversation from your perspective, and how urgent is it to get this done?
I think all of it has been urgent yesterday. And we need to get Security Council reform done, and member states need to be alert to that. That's not going to go as far in further than reiterating its urgency and its need when you don't have some of the major players here. But in the case of the international financial architecture, we have a financing for development dialogue. Ministers of finance are coming, and so I think we will take that further from the opportunities that the Indian presidency or the G20 gave us. You'll see the presidency of Brazil now take over. They will be here, and it'll be, we're waiting to see what are those speeches, what are those commitments that they will make to take that further.
I want to talk a bit about the role of media coverage in the UNGA context. On the one hand, you have this massive developmental agenda that needs attention, but you also then have massive geopolitical divides that tend to overshadow things like the SDGs. You'll be aware of the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. Ukraine's president will be in New York, and it's likely to get massive amounts of media focus, likely drawing attention away from the development deficits you are now seeking to plug. What does it say both about the role, the media's role, but also about the need for diplomacy to be more effective in resolving the geopolitical issues that continue to distract from the existential threat that a lack of development continues to pose?
I think there'll always be that tension. There is a headline that comes out of what is clearly a very difficult situation in Ukraine. That leadership is living that right now, and so when they come and they speak, that's the here and now, and people will want to hear that and they will lean towards it. When you talk about development, you're talking about longer term investments and return. That's much more difficult to get people's attention to. Any time it has happened has perhaps been with a humanitarian face. And I think that's what we've got to do a little bit more with the media, find how we can take the discussions of what is a crisis today and see the solution to it in the SDGs, in development investments. And perhaps if we do that a little bit better and see how joined up that is, maybe we will get the headlines. One does not expect always to get them, but at least to get the actions that will build the momentum of populations to put pressure on their governments and their leaders to do something about it. That it is as important that people are going to bed hungry as it is that we are losing lives in a war that should not have happened in 2023 in Europe.
What is the short answer to that response, right? I mean, we have such short attention spans, DSG. What's the role of the media in terms of covering the SDGs, particularly given at this midway point that we are lagging hopelessly behind?
Well, perhaps if the media did what we're asking business to do, which is put people and planet at the center of their work, it might work.
You've done a few UN General Assemblies over your time at the United Nations. What are you most looking forward to over the next week and a bit?
I think most looking forward to the stakeholders that we've opened the doors to, because out from those stakeholder gatherings will come many solutions, but also the work to do as we leave here. We cannot just leave the problems and the headlines in the United Nations. We have to take them out with us. Homework to do at home for leaders, for constituents, for civil society, for women. So for me, that engagement, the fact that we can bring the world into the UN, and then you take out those issues that we have framed for people and for our Earth out and get something done about them, something more in the second half. We have to be determined to use those solutions and get them done. We have to reinforce solidarity of our human family. That's sadly lacking right now.
Amina Mohammed, as always, thanks for making time to speak with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Amina Mohammed serves as the 5th Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations and chairs the UN Sustainable Development Group, in conversation with us ahead of the UN General Assembly High-Level Week, September 18th to the 26th.